The fire in the sky. The alien night sky blazed as a streak of fire tore across the heavens. Solarians, the native inhabitants of the planet Zorithia, whispered in hushed tones, their bioluminescent markings flickering in agitation. Such phenomena were rare, and to Linara, a young Zolorian scout, it was a bad omen. From her perch high in the tangled branches of a sprawling lumina tree, she watched the flaming object plummet to the surface with a thunderous crash. The forest trembled with the impact, sending small creatures scattering into the darkness. Linara hesitated, her clawed hands gripping the bark. Curiosity warred with caution, but her instincts as a scout won. She had to investigate. Wrapping her camouflaged cloak tightly around her slender frame, Linara descended from the tree with feline grace and darted toward the source of the disturbance. Meanwhile, Captain Elias Hart groaned as he pushed a heavy piece of debris off his chest. His pulse pounded in his ears as the world around him spun. The crash had been worse than anything he'd trained for during his years in the Space Exploration Corps. His ship, the Aegis, had been caught in a rogue gravity well while mapping uncharted space, pulling him into the atmosphere of this unrecorded planet. Through the shattered remnants of the cockpit, Elias could see dense vegetation glowing faintly under the light of 2 alien moons. The air was heavy and humid, carrying an unfamiliar scent that was both sweet and sharp. His spacesuit's environmental sensors were already warning him of airborne particles that could be hazardous. He reached for his emergency oxygen canister and secured it to his suit. Elias grabbed his survival pack, checking its contents with shaking hands. A multi-tool, a flare gun, ration bars, and a water filtration device. His fingers paused over the cracked communication device. It was beyond repair. Isolation set in like a cold weight in his chest, but Elias squared his jaw. Giving in to despair wasn't an option. Stepping out of the wreck, he found himself surrounded by towering, glowing flora. Trees with translucent bark pulsed faintly as though they had a heartbeat. Strange, bulbous flowers emitted a soft hum, their petals shifting as if alive. The scene was both breathtaking and unsettling. He had always dreamed of discovering new worlds, but not like this. Stranded, alone, and vulnerable. Unbeknownst to Elias, he was being watched. Linara crouched silently in the underbrush, her wide, reflective eyes fixed on the strange creature before her. She had never seen anything like him. His pale skin, strange garments, and upright posture marked him as an intruder. His exposed teeth glinted in the moonlight, and Linara's heart raced. Those sharp, omnivorous teeth could only belong to a predator. Instinctively, she reached for the small blade she carried, her markings dimming as her body tensed. Elias began to explore the area around the crash site. His movements were cautious but purposeful as he collected fragments of his ship that might be useful for survival. He knelt to examine a shard of the ship's hull when a sudden movement caught his attention. He froze, his hand instinctively moving to the flare gun at his belt. Linara ducked behind a glowing bush, her heart pounding. The intruder's eyes were sharp and searching. She couldn't risk being seen, but she couldn't leave either. This predator had brought fire from the sky, and she needed to know if he was a threat to her people. Elias's eyes scanned the undergrowth but found nothing. Probably just a small animal, he muttered to himself, though the feeling of being watched lingered. Shaking off his unease, he continued gathering supplies. His primary concern was shelter. The forest was alive with sounds, chirps, growls, and low, resonant hums that seemed to come from the trees themselves. Nightfall on this alien world would undoubtedly bring dangers he couldn't yet imagine. Linara trailed him from a distance, her footsteps silent. She observed his every move, puzzled by his behavior. He didn't hunt or attack the creatures that crossed his path. Instead, he seemed cautious, even vulnerable, as he carefully avoided touching the glowing flora. He didn't seem like the vicious predator she had assumed, but Linara wasn't ready to trust him yet. As the hours passed, Elias found a small clearing surrounded by thick, vine-covered trees. He began constructing a crude shelter using fragments of his ship and the resilient vines he had encountered earlier. Sweat poured down his face as he worked, the humid air clinging to his skin. He knew he needed rest, but the thought of sleeping exposed in such an unfamiliar environment made his stomach churn. From her hiding place, Linera watched with growing curiosity. This creature was resourceful, but it was clear he didn't belong here. His movements were awkward and hesitant, lacking the fluidity of someone accustomed to Zorathia's wild terrain. She couldn't decide whether to fear him or pity him. Just as Elias secured the final piece of his shelter, a low growl broke the relative silence. He spun around, his flare gun raised. From the shadows emerged a predator unlike anything he had ever seen. A massive, six-limbed beast with glowing eyes and fangs that dripped with venom. Its muscular body was covered in dark, iridescent scales, and it moved with a deadly grace. Elias's heart raced, but his training kicked in. He fired the flare gun, the bright light momentarily startling the creature. It recoiled with a guttural snarl, giving Elias just enough time to grab a piece of jagged metal from his shelter. The creature lunged, and Elias dodged, slashing at its flank. The makeshift weapon bit into its flesh, but the beast barely flinched. Linera watched in awe and terror as the battle unfolded. The intruder fought with a ferocity she hadn't expected, his movements precise despite the obvious fatigue in his body. When the beast lunged again, Elias rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding its snapping jaws. He struck again, this time driving the metal shard deep into the creature's side. It let out a pained roar before retreating into the forest. Breathing heavily, Elias collapsed to his knees, his hands trembling. The adrenaline coursing through his veins was the only thing keeping him upright. He didn't notice Linera slipping away, her mind reeling. This predator, this strange, sky-fallen creature, had shown remarkable bravery. Perhaps he wasn't the monster she had feared. As Elias leaned back against his makeshift shelter, his gaze wandered to the stars above. He felt the weight of his isolation, but a spark of determination flickered in his chest. He would survive. Whatever this planet threw at him, he would endure. And in the shadows, Linera made a decision that would change both their fates forever. A fragile alliance. The dense, bioluminescent forest of Zorathia pulsed with life as Captain Elias' heart woke to the soft hum of alien creatures greeting the dawn. The events of the previous night, his crash, the harrowing battle with the predator, and the creeping realization of isolation hung heavy on his mind. He rubbed his temples and surveyed his surroundings. His makeshift shelter had held through the night, though it was clear that such basic protection wouldn't last long against the planet's dangers. Elias stretched his sore limbs and checked his oxygen module. It had enough reserves for a few more days, but after that, he'd be at the mercy of Zorathia's atmosphere, a mix of gases his body hadn't evolved to process. He let out a deep sigh. One step at a time, he muttered, gathering his gear and preparing to scout the area. Unbeknownst to him, Linera was nearby, watching. The young Zalorian scout had not slept. She had spent the night hidden in the dense foliage, her thoughts racing. The fire-falling creature, this human, as her people would later call him, was unlike anything she'd ever seen. He was resourceful, strong, and dangerous, yet he hadn't behaved like the predators she knew. He fought to survive, not to hunt. He had shown fear, pain, and even vulnerability. Linera's tribe had strict rules about outsiders. Any threat to their ecosystem or way of life was to be eliminated, but Linera couldn't bring herself to act. Something about this human intrigued her. Perhaps it was his resilience, or maybe it was the strange, fleeting expressions of wonder she had caught on his face as he navigated her world. Against her better judgment, she decided to follow him again. The encounter. Elias pushed through the thick underbrush, his multi-tool in hand to cut through the vines that seemed almost alive in their movements. His goal was simple: find water and food. The survival kit's rations wouldn't last long. and he needed to identify edible flora or fauna, if such a thing even existed here. The glowing plants towered over him, their tendrils swaying gently as though responding to his presence. Occasionally, he heard distant growls or rustling, a reminder of the predators that lurked in the shadows. Every sound set his nerves on edge, but he pressed forward, his training keeping him focused. He stumbled upon a clearing where a crystalline stream snaked through the forest. The water sparkled with an unnatural shimmer, as though infused with the bioluminescence that characterized everything on this strange planet. Cautiously, Elias knelt by the stream and used his filtration device to extract a sample. As he studied the results on his device's small screen, he felt the weight of being watched again. Linera crouched silently behind a bush, her reflective eyes fixed on the human. She had followed him to the stream, curious about what he would do. When she saw him examining the water, she hesitated. The stream contained trace amounts of toxic minerals that her people had long since adapted to, but she doubted the same was true for him. If he drank it without knowing, he might not survive. Her heart beat rapidly as she debated whether to reveal herself. Zalorian law forbade aiding outsiders, but something about this human made her question the strict doctrines she had been taught. Before she could make a decision, Elias's voice broke the silence. "Who's there?" he called, his tone sharp but not hostile. He had felt her presence for the past hour, the prickling sensation of being watched never leaving him. Slowly, he stood and turned, his hand resting on his flare gun. Linera froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had been careless, letting a single branch crack beneath her weight. For a moment, neither moved. Then, summoning her courage, Linera stepped out from the shadows, her cloaked figure shimmering faintly under the forest's light. First contact. Elias stared in disbelief as the figure emerged. She was humanoid, but her differences were striking. Her skin glowed faintly with shifting patterns of light, her eyes were large and reflective, and her movements were impossibly graceful. The alien was shorter than him, her frame lithe, and her features both beautiful and unsettling. Linera raised a hand cautiously, signaling she meant no harm. Elias hesitated, his instincts warring with his curiosity. He lowered his flare gun but kept it in hand, just in case. "You've been following me," he said, his voice calm but firm. Linera tilted her head, not understanding his words but catching the tone. She pointed to the stream and made a sharp, disapproving gesture, trying to convey that the water was dangerous. Elias frowned, watching her gestures. He pointed to the stream, then back to her, his expression questioning. Linera nodded emphatically, then pointed to his filtration device, and mind throwing it away. Elias's eyes widened as he pieced together her warning. "The water's toxic?" he asked, and though she didn't understand his language, his tone made her nod again. For the first time, Elias felt a glimmer of hope. This alien wasn't attacking him. She was helping. He tucked the filtration device back into his pack and raised his hands, palms open, a universal sign of peace. "Thank you," he said softly. Linera studied his face, noting the absence of aggression. Instead, there was gratitude and something else. Relief. She lowered her hand and took a cautious step closer. The two stood in silence, studying each other, two beings from entirely different worlds brought together by survival. An uneasy partnership. The silence was broken by a distant roar. Both Elias and Linera turned toward the sound, their bodies tensing. Elias gripped his flare gun tightly, while Linera instinctively reached for her blade. She looked at him, her glowing markings flashing in rapid pulses, a sign of urgency among her kind. Elias didn't need to understand the language. The message was clear. Danger was approaching. Linera gestured for Elias to follow her, her movements quick and precise. For a moment, he hesitated, torn between trusting this stranger and relying on his own instincts. But as the roar grew louder, he made his decision. "Lead the way," he said, falling in behind her. Linera moved through the forest with practiced ease, navigating the dense foliage as though it were second nature. Elias struggled to keep up, his boots catching on roots and vines. Despite her smaller stature, she moved with a confidence that reassured him. This was her world, and for now, his best chance at survival lay in her hands. As they fled, Ilias couldn't help but feel a strange sense of connection to the alien scout. They were two beings from opposite ends of the galaxy, yet both faced the same primal fight for survival. The forest seemed determined to test their fragile alliance, and Ilias knew that the days ahead would bring even greater challenges. For now, though, he had gained something he hadn't expected on this hostile planet. An ally, bound by survival. The dense, glowing forest of Zorithia closed in around them, the sounds of alien predators echoing ominously in the distance. Linera led the way with a confidence born of familiarity, her glowing markings dimmed to avoid drawing attention. Behind her, Ilias struggled to match her agile pace, his heavier human frame and gear slowing him down. The vines and underbrush tugged at his legs as though trying to ensnare him, but he pushed forward, unwilling to fall behind. Every step deepened their uneasy alliance. Ilias had no idea if this alien being truly trusted him, or if she simply saw him as a temporary asset. For his part, he was caught between awe at her grace and wariness of her intentions. Still, the shared necessity of survival bound them in ways neither could yet articulate. The cave. After what felt like hours of weaving through the alien jungle, Linera abruptly stopped. She raised a hand, motioning for Ilias to be silent. He obeyed, his breath coming in heavy bursts as he crouched behind her. Linera pointed ahead to a rocky outcropping nestled beneath the gnarled roots of a massive tree. A dark opening yawned at its base, barely visible through the tangled foliage. Linera gestured toward the cave and then mimed silence, her glowing markings flickering in a way Ilias instinctively understood as urgency. He nodded, gripping his flare gun tightly as she led the way. The cave was damp and cool, its walls shimmering faintly with an iridescent moss. Linera moved to the center of the space and began inspecting their surroundings, her markings pulsing softly as though scanning for danger. Ilias leaned against the wall, allowing himself a moment to catch his breath. His muscles ached, and his oxygen supply was dwindling faster than he'd anticipated. The thought gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. Linera turned to him, her expression unreadable. She pointed to his oxygen module and tilted her head in question. Ilias hesitated, then held up 3 fingers, miming the approximate number of days he thought he had left. Her eyes narrowed as she processed the gesture. She didn't understand his exact predicament, but she could tell his survival depended on something she didn't fully comprehend. Without warning, Linera stepped closer and reached for the module. Ilias stiffened but didn't pull away, curious to see what she would do. Her delicate fingers traced the edges of the device, and her glowing markings flared brighter as she studied its design. Ilias couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Perhaps she could help him extend its life or find an alternative source of breathable air. The beast returns. The fragile moment of calm was shattered by a low growl reverberating through the cave. Linera froze, her glowing markings dimming to near darkness. Ilias's hand went to his flare gun, his pulse quickening. The growl grew louder, accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps outside the cave. Whatever had made the noise was large and getting closer. Linera motioned for Ilias to move deeper into the cave, her eyes darting toward the entrance. He complied, retreating to a shadowed corner as Linera drew her blade and crouched low. The tension in the air was suffocating. A massive shadow appeared at the mouth of the cave, its form obscured by the glowing jungle beyond. As the creature stepped inside, Ilias recognized it instantly. It was the same 6-limbed predator he had barely survived the night before. Its iridescent scales shimmered faintly in the dim light, and its glowing eyes scanned the cave, its nostrils flaring as it caught their scent. Ilias raised his flare gun, his hand trembling. Linera turned her head slightly, signaling for him to wait. She moved slowly along the cave wall, her steps silent as she positioned herself closer to the beast. Ilias held his breath, unsure whether to trust her strategy or act on his instincts. The beast let out a guttural roar, its attention snapping to Linara as she stepped into its line of sight. For a moment, Elias thought she was about to attack, but instead, she moved with calculated slowness, drawing the creature away from him. It snarled and lunged toward her, its powerful limbs sending debris flying. Linara dodged gracefully, using the cave's uneven terrain to her advantage. As the creature pursued her, Elias saw his opening. Without hesitation, he fired the flare gun. The bright burst of light and heat struck the beast square in the face, causing it to roar in pain and rage. It thrashed wildly, its claws raking the walls as it tried to shake off the disorienting effects. Linara seized the opportunity. She leaped onto the creature's back, driving her blade into the soft tissue between its scales. The beast howled, twisting violently in an attempt to throw her off. Elias scrambled to his feet and grabbed a sharp piece of fallen rock. He charged forward, adrenaline surging through him as he drove the improvised weapon into the creature's flank. The combined assault was too much for the predator. With a final, ear-splitting roar, it collapsed to the ground, its glowing eyes dimming as life left its body. Linara jumped clear just as it fell, landing lightly beside Elias. Both of them stood in silence for a moment, their breaths ragged as the reality of their victory sank in. Elias glanced at Linara, his face a mix of exhaustion and admiration. "We make a good team," he said, even though he knew she wouldn't understand. Linara tilted her head, her glowing markings flaring briefly in what Elias interpreted as amusement or perhaps agreement, an unspoken understanding. After the adrenaline faded, the weight of what they had accomplished, and what it meant, settled over them. Linara began methodically harvesting parts of the predator's body, her movements efficient and purposeful. Elias watched in fascination as she extracted glowing sacs from its neck and sharp teeth from its maw. She held one of the sacs up to him, gesturing to his oxygen module with a questioning look. Elias realized she was trying to help. He carefully took the sac and examined it. The substance inside glowed faintly, and he noticed it gave off a faintly breathable vapor. Could this be an alternative source of oxygen? He wasn't sure, but he appreciated her effort. As they worked together to make the cave more secure, Elias felt the first stirrings of trust between them. Linara, too, began to see the human not as a threat, but as a companion, someone who, like her, was fighting to survive in an unforgiving world. The alliance was still fragile, built on necessity rather than understanding, but it was a start. Both knew that the challenges ahead would be even greater, but for the first time since the crash, neither of them felt entirely alone. The Bridge of Trust. As dawn crept across the bioluminescent canopy of Zorethia, the unlikely allies sat in the quiet shelter of their cave. Linara carefully arranged the glowing sacs she had harvested from the defeated predator, her nimble fingers moving with practiced precision. Elias watched her, his curiosity growing by the second. Every action she took seemed deliberate, purposeful, and deeply connected to her understanding of the alien environment. Elias turned the sac over in his hands, studying it closely. The vapor it emitted seemed to mimic breathable oxygen, though his sensors gave conflicting readings. Could this really work? He muttered to himself. His scientific instincts flared, but he knew he didn't have the tools to fully analyze it. Linara, seeing his uncertainty, placed her own sac down and gestured to him to try it. Her glowing markings pulsed gently, an unspoken message of reassurance. Elias hesitated, but his dwindling oxygen reserves left him little choice. He took a deep breath through his suit's filter, then slowly released it before bringing the sac to his face. Tentatively, he allowed the vapor to seep into his mask. His chest tightened for a brief moment, then relaxed as his lungs adjusted. The vapor wasn't perfect, but it seemed to sustain him. He glanced at Linara, a mixture of relief and gratitude on his face. "Guess you've saved my life twice now," he said, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. Linera tilted her head, her markings glowing faintly in response. Her gestures conveyed a subtle shift, less guarded, more open. The human wasn't just surviving. He was learning. The first lesson. Linera stood abruptly and motioned for Elias to follow her. She picked up her blade and slung a pouch over her shoulder before heading toward the cave's entrance. Elias grabbed his gear, still unsure of her intentions, but curiosity drove him forward. The jungle greeted them with its usual cacophony of sounds, but Linera moved through it with a practiced ease. Elias followed closely, his eyes darting to every rustling bush and shadowed corner. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was always watching. Linera led him to a sprawling grove filled with massive, glowing fungi. Their translucent caps pulsed softly, emitting a faint, sweet aroma. She knelt by one of the fungi and tapped its surface lightly with her blade. The viscous liquid oozed from the stem, pooling at the base. Linera dipped her finger into the liquid and brought it to her lips, miming the act of drinking. Elias frowned, crouching beside her. His survival instincts screamed against consuming anything without testing it first, but he trusted her enough to at least consider it. He pulled out his filtration device and ran a scan of the liquid. The device beeped softly, indicating the presence of nutrients but no immediate toxins. With cautious curiosity, Elias dipped his finger into the liquid and tasted it. The taste was sharp and earthy, but not unpleasant. More importantly, it felt like sustenance. Edible, he murmured, nodding toward Linera. She seemed pleased by his reaction, her markings flaring briefly in approval. Linera continued teaching him, guiding him to other plants and demonstrating their uses. One bore fruit with a tough, leathery skin that, when sliced open, revealed a sweet, gel-like interior. Another exuded a sticky sap that she used to patch a small tear in her cloak. Elias took notes mentally, marveling at her intimate knowledge of the environment. The silent conversation. The lessons went on for hours, and with each passing moment, Elias felt the fragile wall of mistrust between them begin to crumble. Though they didn't share a language, their gestures and expressions created a kind of silent conversation. Elias found himself smiling more, and Linera's movements lost some of their initial caution. When they returned to the cave, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the jungle floor. Linera began preparing the glowing sacks they had collected earlier, arranging them around the cave to provide light. Elias watched her work, a thought forming in his mind. Picking up a stick, he began to draw in the dirt. Linera glanced at him curiously as he sketched the outline of his crashed ship. He pointed to himself, then to the crude drawing, miming the crash and his struggle to survive. Linera's eyes widened slightly, her glowing markings flickering as she seemed to piece together his story. She knelt beside him and used her clawed finger to add to the drawing. She etched out a symbol that looked like a tree, then drew smaller figures beneath it, all connected by glowing lines. She pointed to herself, then to the tree-like symbol. Elias nodded, understanding that this represented her people. Linera hesitated, then added another drawing, a larger figure with sharp teeth and a menacing posture. She pointed to the predator they had fought the night before, then to the symbol of her people, crossing a line between them. Elias frowned, realizing that these creatures were a constant threat to her tribe. Their eyes met, and in that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They were both fighting for survival in a world filled with danger. Their struggles were different, but their goals were the same: to endure, to protect, and to find a way forward. The bridge of trust. That night, the sounds of the jungle seemed a little less menacing. Linera and Elias shared a meal of the strange fruits and fungi she had shown him, their makeshift alliance solidifying with each shared bite. As they ate, Elias felt a warmth he hadn't experienced since before the crash. It wasn't just the sustenance, it was the realization that he wasn't entirely alone. Linera, too, felt a shift in her perspective. This human, so strange and out of place, was more than a predator or a threat. He was resourceful, curious, and capable of empathy. She couldn't yet explain why, but she felt a growing responsibility to ensure his survival, just as he had ensured hers during their battle with the predator. As the bioluminescent light of the cave dimmed, and the jungle outside settled into its nocturnal rhythm, Lenara and Elias sat side by side, the silence between them no longer heavy with mistrust. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, they felt like they had a chance to face it together. The bridge of trust between them was fragile, but it was there. And for now, it was enough. Shadows of the past. The glowing canopy of Zorethia shimmered faintly as morning broke over the alien landscape. The bioluminescent flora dimmed slightly in the daylight, their vibrant hues replaced by a muted luminescence. Inside the safety of their cave, Elias Hart and Lenara prepared for another day of survival. The uneasy alliance between the human and the Zolorian scout had begun to shift, the threads of trust weaving tighter as they relied on each other to navigate the planet's challenges. Lenara stood at the entrance of the cave, her reflective eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. Her glowing markings pulsed in a steady rhythm, signaling calm but alertness. Behind her, Elias packed his gear, checking the glowing sacs that now supplemented his oxygen supply. The vapor was keeping him alive, but he knew it wasn't a permanent solution. He needed to find a way to contact Earth, or at least repair his suit's systems. Elias joined Lenara at the cave's entrance, gesturing toward the jungle. "We need to keep moving," he said, his tone low. Lenara didn't understand his words, but his urgency was clear. She nodded, her markings flickering faintly as she took the lead. The hidden path. Lenara guided Elias through a dense section of the forest, where the glowing trees grew closer together, their twisted roots forming natural bridges over bubbling streams of iridescent liquid. The air was thick with the scent of alien flowers, their colors so vivid they seemed to pulse with life. Elias followed closely, his senses on high alert. He had learned to trust Lenara's instincts, but the jungle was unpredictable, and every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. As they navigated the maze of foliage, Lenara stopped abruptly. She crouched low, motioning for Elias to do the same. Ahead of them was a series of large, clawed footprints embedded in the soft forest floor. The prints were fresh, their edges still damp from the morning dew. Lenara's markings dimmed as she examined the tracks, her sharp eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. Elias knelt beside her, his gaze following hers. "Another predator?" he asked, though he didn't expect an answer. Lenara glanced at him, her expression serious. She mined a large creature with wide gestures, then pointed to the tracks and made a slicing motion with her blade. Elias understood immediately. Whatever had made these tracks was hunting. Lenara motioned for Elias to follow as she veered off the main path, leading him through a narrow passage hidden by thick vines. The ground beneath their feet became firmer, the vegetation thinning as they approached a rocky outcrop. Lenara pointed upward, indicating they should climb. Elias sighed, his muscles already protesting, but he followed her lead, gripping the jagged rocks and pulling himself up. At the top, the view took his breath away. The jungle stretched out below them, a sea of glowing greens, blues, and purples. In the distance, he could see towering cliffs and a waterfall that shimmered with bioluminescent light. But what caught his attention was the structure nestled in the cliffs, a series of interconnected platforms and pathways carved into the rock. It was primitive but clearly a sign of intelligent life. "Your people?" Elias asked, pointing to the structure. Lenara nodded but didn't smile. Her markings dimmed further, a sign of unease. The ghost of Lenara's tribe. As they descended from the outcrop, Lenara's pace slowed. She seemed hesitant, her usual confidence replaced by a tension that Elias hadn't seen before. When they reached the base of the cliffs, Lenara stopped and gestured for Elias to wait. She pointed to herself, then toward the structure, signaling that she needed to go alone. Elias frowned but nodded. "I'll wait here," he said, though he doubted she understood. He watched as Linera disappeared into the shadows, her markings blending seamlessly with the glowing environment. Linera moved cautiously through the pathways of the abandoned Zalorian outpost. Her heart ached as she passed the remnants of her people's presence, discarded tools, faintly glowing carvings on the rock walls, and the remains of a communal fire pit. This had been her tribe's home before the predators drove them deeper into the jungle. She had grown up here, surrounded by the laughter and light of her kin. Now, the silence was deafening. As she reached the central platform, Linera knelt by a small cache of supplies hidden beneath a loose stone. She retrieved a bundle of dried herbs and a small vial filled with a glowing liquid. These were remnants of Zalorian medicine designed to heal and protect. Linera had hoped to find more, but the cache was nearly empty. Her markings dimmed further as she stood, her thoughts clouded by memories. The predators had been relentless, their attacks forcing her people to scatter. She didn't know if her tribe had survived, or if she was the last. The thought made her chest tighten, but she pushed it aside. She had a responsibility now, not just to herself, but to the human who had saved her life. A new threat. While Linera searched the outpost, Elias waited near the cliffs, his gaze fixed on the jungle below. The eerie beauty of the glowing forest did little to ease his unease. Every rustle of leaves or distant growl set his nerves on edge. He checked his flare gun, ensuring it was loaded, and scanned the area for anything he could use as a weapon. The ground trembled slightly, a subtle vibration that sent a chill down his spine. Elias froze, his hand tightening around the flare gun. The vibrations grew stronger, accompanied by a low guttural sound that seemed to echo from all directions. Whatever was approaching was large, and it was getting closer. Elias rose to his feet, his heart pounding. He turned toward the cliff, hoping to see Linera returning, but she was nowhere in sight. The jungle ahead began to shift as something massive moved through the trees. The first thing Elias saw were its eyes, glowing orbs of predatory intent, set into a head adorned with sharp, spiked ridges. The creature was unlike the predator they had fought before. It was larger, more armored, and clearly built for killing. Elias raised his flare gun, his mind racing. He was outmatched, and he knew it. Linera, he muttered under his breath, glancing toward the cliff again. He needed her help. Linera's return. Linera emerged from the outpost just as the predator stepped into the clearing. Her markings flared brightly in alarm as she took in the scene. Elias, standing his ground with a flimsy weapon, and the massive beast stalking toward him. She didn't hesitate. Drawing her blade, Linera let out a sharp, piercing call that echoed through the cliffs. The predator turned its attention to her, its glowing eyes narrowing as it recognized a new target. Elias used the distraction to fire his flare gun, the bright burst of light startling the creature. Linera took the opportunity to charge, her blade gleaming as she aimed for the beast's vulnerable joints. The battle was fierce and chaotic, with Elias and Linera working in unison despite their lack of communication. Elias used his environment, hurling rocks and debris to distract the predator, while Linera's swift, precise movements kept it off balance. Together, they brought the creature down, its massive form collapsing with a final guttural roar. Breathing heavily, Elias looked at Linera, a mix of exhaustion and admiration in his eyes. "We're getting good at this," he said with a faint smile. Linera didn't respond with words, but her markings pulsed gently, a sign of agreement. For the first time, Elias thought he saw a hint of a smile on her face. Their partnership had evolved from necessity to something deeper. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were fighting for each other. And in this hostile, alien world, that made all the difference.